My name is Nia. I am 32 years old and the Director of Mergers and Acquisitions at a private equity firm in Atlanta. But to my family, I am just the unmarried disappointment. At Thanksgiving dinner, my mother looked me dead in the eyes in front of everyone and called me a burden. My brother laughed and said at least he made the family proud. I did not scream or cry. I simply put down my fork, stood up, and left without a single word. 7 months later, my father called me in a panic because their historic Tudor mansion was being foreclosed on. He demanded I fix it. I just smiled and told him to ask his pride and joy about the forged paperwork. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever been the black sheep who ended up holding all the cards. I carried the heavy glass baking dish up the brick steps of my parents' historic Tudor home in the Cascade neighborhood of Atlanta. This area was a historic stronghold of black excellence and generational wealth, and my parents wore their address like a crown. The air inside smelled rich and familiar, filled with the scent of roasted turkey, candied yams, and heavily seasoned collard greens. Yet the atmosphere the moment I stepped through the grand double doors was as stiff and unforgiving as my mother Vivian's posture. I carefully set down my grandmother's legacy baked macaroni and cheese right in the center of the massive mahogany dining table. It was a recipe that had been in our family for 4 generations, a symbol of our history and our survival through harder times. It took me 3 hours to prepare it from scratch, just the way my grandmother taught me. Before I could even pull my hands away from the warm glass, my sister-in-law Harper slid a massive oversized ceramic bowl directly next to it, intentionally nudging my dish off center. Harper pushed her blonde hair over her shoulder and flashed a tight, bright smile that completely failed to reach her eyes. I decided to bring a low-carb, ethically sourced truffle salad this year, Harper announced loudly, making absolutely sure everyone in the adjacent living room could hear her clear soprano voice. Some of us are actually watching our figures, and we cannot all afford to indulge in heavy soul food every single holiday. I bit the inside of my cheek hard to keep my face perfectly neutral. Harper had been married to my older brother Trey for 3 years, and her subtle digs disguised as casual health-conscious conversation were a toxic staple at every single family gathering. She loved to assert her presence by subtly putting down our traditions while pretending to be an enlightened savior. I was just about to tell her that nobody was forcing her to eat the macaroni and that soul food was not the enemy when my mother walked into the room. Vivian swept in wearing a tailored emerald green dress, her eyes immediately bypassing my carefully prepared dish to land squarely on Harper's pile of expensive lettuce. "Oh, Harper, that looks absolutely divine," my mother cooed, placing an affectionate hand on Harper's shoulder. "It is so refreshing to have modern, healthy options on the table. Thank you for thinking of our waistlines, darling." My mother then turned her cold gaze to me, her warm smile dropping instantly as her eyes scanned me from head to toe, judging every fabric choice. "Nia, are you really wearing a gray pantsuit to Thanksgiving dinner? You look like you are about to depose someone in a courtroom." I smoothed the lapel of my custom-tailored jacket, trying to push down the familiar sting of her immediate disapproval. "I came straight from the office, Mom. We just closed a major commercial real estate acquisition, and the negotiations ran late. I wanted to be here to help set up." My mother sighed, a sharp, exasperated sound that I had heard echoing through my entire life. Always crunching numbers and buried in paperwork, she complained, adjusting a silver candlestick. "You are 32 years old, Nia. Your financial spreadsheets are not going to keep you warm at night. Look at your brother. He is 34, happily married to a wonderful woman, and building real generational wealth for this family. You are falling behind because you refuse to prioritize finding a good husband. You are just a corporate drone missing out on real life." I took a deep breath, letting her harsh words wash over me without giving her the explosive reaction she always wanted. "I am a director of mergers and acquisitions, Mom. I manage real estate portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I am doing just fine on my own. She waved her hand dismissively, turning her back to me to arrange the fine china. Money from a corporate paycheck is not the same as building an empire. Trey understands that. He takes risks. He creates opportunities. Speaking of Trey, go tell the men dinner is ready. Do not just stand there being a burden. The word burden hung in the air heavy and suffocating. It was not the first time she had used it to describe me, but it always felt like a physical blow to my chest. I walked away from the dining room and stepped into the living room, where my father Desmond was proudly pouring a glass of expensive bourbon for Trey. Trey was wearing a designer cashmere sweater that I knew for a fact cost more than his monthly car payment. He was leaning back in his father's leather armchair, acting like he owned the entire world. "Dinner is ready," I said flatly, turning on my heel before they could ask me to fetch them anything else. We all gathered around the long dining table, taking our assigned seats. The crystal water glasses sparkled brightly under the vintage chandelier, projecting the absolute perfect image of a wealthy, successful family. But I sat there knowing the reality was built entirely on smoke mirrors and crippling credit card debt. As soon as the plates were filled with food, Trey tapped his silver fork against his wine glass. The sharp clinking sound rang out, demanding everyone's immediate and undivided attention. My father beamed from the head of the table, already anticipating greatness from his golden boy. "I have a major announcement to make," Trey said, standing up and puffing out his chest so his designer sweater stretched tight. "As you all know, I have been working tirelessly on my venture capital investments and aggressively expanding my cryptocurrency portfolio. The market has been incredibly lucrative for those of us who know how to truly navigate the blockchain and leverage decentralized assets." He paused for dramatic effect, looking directly and deeply at my parents. "Mom, Dad, I wanted to take this moment to thank you for everything you have done for me. And to show my ultimate appreciation, I took a portion of my massive crypto venture profits this week and did something very special. I completely paid off the remaining mortgage on this house. You own it free and clear." The table erupted in pure chaos. My mother gasped loudly, dropping her silver fork onto her plate as heavy tears welled in her eyes. Harper clapped her hands enthusiastically, looking around the room to make sure everyone saw how proud she was of her husband. My father Desmond stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. His voice was choked with heavy emotion as he walked over and pulled Trey into a tight, aggressive embrace. "Son," my father said, his voice trembling with pride, "this is exactly what generational wealth looks like. You have officially secured our family legacy. You stepped up as the true man of the house today. I could not be prouder to call you my son. You are a visionary leader." I sat there staring at my brother while the rest of the table celebrated. Something was terribly wrong with his story. I work in high-level institutional finance. I analyze distressed debt asset liquidity and market trends every single day for a living. I knew for an absolute fact that the crypto market had been in a brutal historic downturn for the past 8 months. Major digital exchanges were crashing, burning billions in retail money, and venture capital funding for blockchain startups had dried up almost entirely. Furthermore, paying off a substantial mortgage on a historic Cascade property in Atlanta would require hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure liquid cash. "Trey," I said, my voice calm, steady and measured, cutting sharply through the celebratory noise. "That is incredibly generous of you. But I am genuinely curious. How exactly did you liquidate that much crypto without triggering a massive capital gains tax event? And which specific exchange did you use to facilitate a direct wire transfer to the mortgage lender?" The room went dead silent. The joyous holiday atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Trey's confident, arrogant smile faltered and dropped. His eyes darted nervously toward the hallway for a fraction of a second before hardening into an aggressive glare. He shifted his weight from side to side, pulling uncomfortably at the collar of his expensive sweater. "I used a decentralized leverage protocol." Trey stammered, his voice completely lacking its previous booming authority. It is complex back-end stuff, Nia. It involves algorithmic staking and offshore liquidity pools. You would not understand it, because it is not your boring traditional banking stuff. It is the future of finance, and you are stuck in the past. My father slammed his heavy hand down on the dining table, making the fine china and silverware rattle violently. Nia, why must you always do this? My father demanded, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Your brother does something monumental for this family today, something absolutely incredible, and you immediately try to tear him down with your cynical corporate interrogations. You cannot stand his success. Harper leaned forward across the table, her eyes narrowing as she glared at me with pure venom. Seriously, Naya, you are always so jealous and so unsupportive. Trey is out here changing the world and making real money, and you just sit there hating on him because you are stuck in a miserable corporate job. You cannot stand to see a black man succeed. I am not hating, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even and refusing to take her bait. I am asking a basic financial question because transferring that amount of capital leaves a massive, unavoidable paper trail. If he paid off the house, there should be a reconveyance deed recorded with the county clerk. Did you get the deed, Dad? My mother slammed her wineglass down, spilling red wine onto the white tablecloth. That is enough, she shouted, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at my face. I will not have you ruining this Thanksgiving with your bitter, disgusting jealousy. You cannot stand that your brother is the absolute pride of this family. You have always been a dark cloud in this house. You are just a burden. You always have been, and you always will be. At least I make this family proud, Trey laughed, sensing the shift in power back to his side and seizing the moment to humiliate me. When are you going to stop mooching off their energy and actually do something meaningful with your life? I looked around the large dining table. I saw my father glaring at me with undisguised contempt. I saw my mother looking at me like I was worthless garbage. I saw Harper smirking in absolute triumph. And I saw Trey, the desperate fraud, basking in their blind, foolish adoration. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not cry a single tear. I simply put down my fork on my plate. I stood up, pushed my heavy wooden chair back, and walked to the hallway to grab my coat. I hope your pride keeps this house warm, I said, looking dead into my mother's angry eyes. I walked out the front door into the crisp November air, leaving my grandmother's macaroni untouched on the table and walking away from my family forever. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, severing the ties to 32 years of emotional manipulation. The crisp November wind bit at my face, but for the first time in my entire life, I did not feel cold. I felt remarkably light. I walked down the long brick driveway of the Cascade Tudor mansion, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. No one followed me. No one called out my name. My mother did not rush to the porch to demand an apology, and my father did not chase after me to demand respect. They were too busy inside celebrating the illusion of a wealthy son who had just mathematically lied to their faces. I unlocked my car, a sleek black sedan that I bought and paid for with my own money, and slid into the driver's seat. I did not immediately start the engine. I sat there in the quiet darkness of the affluent neighborhood, processing what had just happened. My mother had looked at me, the daughter who managed multi-million-dollar acquisitions, and called me a burden. My brother, a man drowning in undocumented crypto losses, had laughed and accused me of mooching off their energy. It was a spectacular display of psychological projection. They needed me to be the failure, so Trey could be the savior. I pulled my phone from my purse and opened the family group chat. The chat was already active. Harper had sent a message complaining about how I ruined the holiday vibe. My mother responded saying I would come crawling back when I needed money. I did not type a response. I did not defend myself. I simply swiped left and selected the option to leave the group. A small notification popped up confirming my exit. Then I went to my contacts and blocked my mother, my father, Trey, and Harper. I blocked their phone numbers, their email addresses, and their social media accounts. The absolute cutoff had officially begun. I started the engine and drove away from the historic neighborhood, watching the large manicured lawns and towering oak trees fade in my rearview mirror. The drive back to my own place was the most peaceful journey I had experienced in years. I did not turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the engine and the quiet certainty of my own decisions. For decades, I had tried to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I brought home perfect report cards, secured a top-tier corporate job, and remained completely financially independent. Yet in their eyes, I was always falling behind because I did not conform to their specific outdated narrative. They wanted a docile daughter who would applaud her brother's mediocre achievements while quietly accepting her own supposed inferiority. I was never going to be that woman. When I arrived at my apartment, I poured myself a glass of expensive wine that Harper would probably criticize and stood by the window looking out at the Atlanta skyline. The city lights glittered like a promise. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at their table, but tonight I realized I owned the entire building where my own table sat. The days following Thanksgiving were predictably quiet. The toxic cycle of my family relied on my eventual submission. Usually after a disagreement, I would be the one expected to reach out to smooth things over and to apologize for upsetting my mother. This time, the silence stretched from days into weeks. I knew they were waiting for me to break. They assumed I was sitting alone in my apartment regretting my actions and missing their company. They had absolutely no idea that their absence was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. My mind was completely clear. Without the constant drain of their passive-aggressive comments and manufactured drama, my professional focus sharpened to a razor edge. I threw myself entirely into my work at the private equity firm. We were entering the fourth quarter, and the mergers and acquisitions market was incredibly volatile. It required sharp instincts and ruthless execution. I thrived in that environment. While Trey was likely sweating over his crashing digital wallets, I was analyzing massive commercial portfolios and closing legitimate, verifiable deals. The silence from my family allowed me to reclaim the mental energy they had been siphoning from me for years. I stopped second-guessing my choices. I stopped wondering if I was doing enough. I stopped feeling guilty for being a single woman who prioritized her career over a forced marriage. The burden they accused me of being was actually the weight of their own unrealistic expectations, and I had finally put it down. As November turned into December, the holiday season approached. Typically, this would be a time of intense anxiety for me. I would spend weeks stressing over what gifts to buy them, knowing my mother would inevitably find a flaw in whatever I chose. I would dread the Christmas Eve dinner, where Trey would inevitably brag about some new fictional venture. This year, I bought nothing. I made no plans to return to Cascade. I spent Christmas morning at a luxury spa downtown, treating myself to a massage and a facial. I enjoyed a quiet, expensive dinner at a five-star restaurant where the waiter treated me with more respect than my own family ever had. I was completely unbothered. I was building my empire brick by brick, deal by deal, in absolute silence. They thought they had discarded a burden, but they had actually unleashed a powerhouse. They had no idea what I was truly capable of, and they had no idea that the very financial expertise they mocked at the Thanksgiving table was about to become the instrument of their total destruction. The cutoff was not just a protective measure for my mental health. It was the strategic repositioning I needed to observe their inevitable collapse from a safe and highly profitable distance. My family had chosen their golden child. Now they were going to have to live with the consequences of that choice. The real world does not run on empty boasts and forged confidence. It runs on capital contracts and undeniable proof. And I held all three. The air in the Buckhead conference room was frigid, but I barely felt it. I slid the revised term sheet across the expansive glass table. Across from me sat three executives from a rival logistics firm shifting uncomfortably in their custom suits. 3 months had passed since that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. While my family spent the winter holidays pretending their financial foundation was secure, I spent them dissecting corporate portfolios and hunting for weaknesses in the market. I tapped my gold pen against the financial disclosures lying between us. You are overvaluing your Class B commercial spaces by 20%, I said, keeping my voice absolutely flat. Your projected revenue for the upcoming fiscal year relies on lease renewals from 3 anchor tenants who have already filed for bankruptcy protection. You are trying to sell us a sinking ship at a premium price. The lead executive opened his mouth to argue, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. The acquisition price is $42 million, not $50. We are absorbing your mezzanine debt and providing a clean exit before your shareholders realize you are actually insolvent. You have exactly 10 minutes to sign this agreement before I withdraw the offer and let the open market tear your company apart. They signed. My managing partner Richard watched the entire exchange with a look of absolute reverence. When the executives finally left the room, he poured 2 glasses of scotch and handed one to me. "Nia, you are a lethal weapon," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "That acquisition just secured our firm's logistics dominance in the entire Southeast region. Check your email. Your bonus structure for this quarter was just finalized and approved by the board." I set the glass down and opened my secure banking application on my phone. The notification was already there. A direct wire transfer from the firm. 7 figures. A massive multi-million-dollar performance bonus deposited directly into my private checking account. Clean, liquid, undeniable cash. I stared at the comma separating the zeros. I thought back to the dining room table in Cascade. I thought about my mother Vivian sneering at my pantsuit, calling me a corporate drone. I thought about Trey arrogantly boasting about his decentralized crypto protocols while sweating through his cashmere sweater. They called me a burden. They told me I was wasting my life crunching numbers because I did not have a husband to validate my existence. Yet here I was, sitting in a corner office in Buckhead, staring at a single bank deposit that eclipsed the entire net worth of my parents' historic estate. I did not need a man to build generational wealth. I was the generational wealth. I locked my phone and stood up. I had zero intention of buying designer bags or flashy cars like my brother and his wife. Wealth that shouts is usually broke. True power moves in absolute silence. Later that afternoon, I met a luxury real estate broker in Midtown Atlanta. The building was a sleek, modern glass tower offering exclusive panoramic views of the city skyline. The broker, an older gentleman who clearly underestimated me based on my age, spent the first 20 minutes explaining basic homeowner association fees and current interest rates. He showed me the crown jewel of the building. A sprawling penthouse with 12-foot ceilings, wraparound windows, a private elevator entrance, and a custom chef's kitchen outfitted in black marble and brushed brass. It was immaculate. It was a fortress in the sky, far removed from the petty suburban squabbles of my family. The master suite featured a custom walk-in closet larger than the bedroom I grew up in, and a soaking tub that overlooked the bustling streets below. "This property is currently listed at $2.8 million, the broker said, smoothing his tie. "It is a highly competitive market right now. If you are serious, we can connect you with our preferred lenders to get you pre-approved for a jumbo mortgage. The rates are steep, but with a strong cosigner, I am sure we can make it work." I turned away from the floor-to-ceiling window and looked at him. "I do not need a lender," I said, opening my designer briefcase. "And I definitely do not need a cosigner." I pulled out a certified bank draft that I had arranged earlier that day. I placed the cashier's check directly on the black marble kitchen island. "I am offering $2.6 million flat, all cash, no financing contingencies, 30-day close." The broker stared at the piece of paper, his jaw slightly slack. He looked from the check to my face, suddenly realizing that the quiet black woman in the tailored suit was not window shopping. She was an apex predator closing another deal. "I will call the seller immediately," he stammered, scrambling to pull out his phone. Within an hour, the paperwork was signed. By the time the ink dried, I officially owned a multi-million-dollar piece of Atlanta real estate, free and clear. I walked out onto the expansive private terrace of my new home. The wind whipped through my hair as I looked down at the traffic crawling along Peachtree Street. I had built a real empire. There were no fake offshore liquidity pools. There were no frantic phone calls trying to cover bad bets. There was only solid, verifiable equity. Every brick, every pane of glass in this penthouse was mine. I relied on absolutely no one but myself to get here. My family had spent 32 years trying to convince me that I was less than them because I did not play their superficial games. They believed my independence was a character flaw, but standing on top of the city, I realized their rejection was the ultimate catalyst for my freedom. While my parents were busy parading Trey around their country club as the golden boy, I was quietly dominating the very financial sectors they pretended to understand. They were clinging to an illusion of success, while I was aggressively acquiring the reality of it. The contrast was almost poetic. They were loud and broke. I was silent and rich. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the complimentary bottle the broker had left behind and leaned against the glass railing. I felt no urge to call my mother and brag. I had no desire to post a photo of my new keys on social media for Trey and Harper to see. The need for their validation had died completely on Thanksgiving Day. Let them have their turkey and their toxic hierarchy. I had an empire to run. 2 months after moving into the penthouse, the market shifted exactly as I had predicted. The looming economic downturn forced major national banks to aggressively offload their toxic assets just to keep their balance sheets looking pristine for nervous shareholders. My firm specialized in cleaning up these exact institutional messes. Richard assigned me to lead the acquisition team for a massive distressed debt portfolio being liquidated by one of the largest commercial banks in the country. We were negotiating to buy a colossal bundle of bad mortgages, defaulted commercial loans, and pre-foreclosure properties for literally pennies on the dollar. It was ruthless, high-stakes work. We were essentially purchasing the financial failures of thousands of people and deciding which properties to liquidate, which to restructure, and which to send straight to the county auction block. I spent weeks locked in my corner office, executing the final due diligence on the transaction, reviewing risk models, and projecting recovery margins. When the ink finally dried, my firm owned over $400 million in distressed residential and commercial debt across the eastern seaboard. Because I orchestrated the deal, I was officially placed in charge of managing the Atlanta sector of the portfolio. It was past midnight on a Thursday. I was sitting at the black marble island in my penthouse, illuminated only by the glow of my dual monitors and the soft ambient lighting of the city skyline shining through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city was asleep, but the financial markets never truly rested. A glass of sparkling water sat untouched next to my keyboard. I was meticulously combing through the massive master spreadsheet of real estate owned and pre-foreclosure lists we had just acquired from the bank. My job tonight was to categorize the high-value assets. I needed to determine the current market value against the outstanding debt and flag the properties that were beyond saving. Those doomed properties would be fast-tracked for public auction to quickly recoup our firm's initial investment. It was a tedious and incredibly clinical process. I treated every single address like a simple data point, a string of numbers on a spreadsheet entirely devoid of emotion or history. I scrolled past defaulted luxury condos in Buckhead, abandoned strip malls in Decatur, and over-leveraged McMansions in Alpharetta. Line by line, row by row, I evaluated the financial ruins of complete strangers without a second thought. I filtered the spreadsheet by zip code, focusing specifically on the properties located in the affluent southwestern suburbs. The Cascade area was known for its historic black wealth, sprawling estates, and old money prestige. Properties there rarely went into foreclosure unless something catastrophic had occurred. My eyes scanned the screen, rapidly tracking property types, default durations, and principal balances. Then my finger froze on the trackpad. I stopped scrolling entirely. The air in my lungs vanished. My breath hitched in my throat as my eyes locked onto a single line of text on row 412. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, convinced the late hour and the glowing monitors were playing a cruel trick on my vision. But the screen did not change. The address staring back at me was etched into my memory. It was the historic Tudor mansion in Cascade. It was the sprawling estate with the manicured lawns and the grand mahogany doors. It was my parents' house. My heart hammered against my ribs with a heavy, violent rhythm. I grabbed my mouse and clicked on the hyperlinked property file, bypassing the basic portfolio summary and diving straight into the raw bank data. The screen immediately populated with the full legal and financial history of the estate. The names listed on the primary deed were Desmond and Vivian, my parents. But the legal documents attached to the defaulted loan told a completely different and utterly terrifying story. The property was severely underwater. The original lender had flagged it as a critical institutional loss. According to the timeline, the monthly mortgage payments had abruptly stopped 14 months ago. 14 months of complete financial silence. Not a single dollar had been paid toward the principal or the interest. I aggressively scrolled down to the legal status indicator at the bottom of the file. It was highlighted in bright, angry red. The property was classified as Stage 3 foreclosure. It was officially scheduled to be seized by the bank and placed on the county auction block in less than 90 days. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, staring blindly at the ceiling of my pristine penthouse. The Thanksgiving dinner replayed in my mind with crystal clarity. I heard Trey tapping his silver fork against his wineglass, commanding the room. I heard him arrogantly declare that he had used his massive crypto venture profits to pay off the remaining mortgage. I remembered my father crying tears of joy, calling him the true man of the house, and praising his ability to build generational wealth. I remembered my mother looking down her nose at me, calling me a burden, while basking in the absolute illusion of their financial superiority. It was all a lie, a massive fabricated delusion built on sheer audacity. Trey did not pay off the house. He did not secure the family legacy. The golden child had orchestrated a total financial disaster, and my parents were completely oblivious to the reality of their situation. They were sitting in their historic Tudor mansion, hosting lavish dinner parties, and judging my life choices while sitting on a ticking time bomb. They were less than 3 months away from losing everything they had built their identities around. They were about to be thrown out onto the street, facing complete social ruin in their elite circles. And by a twist of pure cosmic irony, the person holding the legal rights to their destruction was me. Through the corporate acquisition, I now owned the debt. I held the keys to the kingdom they had banished me from. I sat forward, the initial shock morphing into a cold and clinical focus. I needed to see exactly how the golden child had managed to torpedo a 30-year-old paid-down mortgage. My security clearance at the firm granted me unrestricted access to the original loan origination files, the digital vault where the bank stored every signed contract identity verification and wire authorization. I bypassed the summary dashboard and downloaded the entire raw PDF packet for the Cascade property. The file was massive, containing over 200 pages of legal jargon and banking disclosures. I cracked my knuckles and began to read, treating my family's financial ruin with the same ruthless scrutiny I applied to corporate acquisitions. It did not take long to find the smoking gun. On page 47, nestled between standard disclosure forms, was a notarized general power of attorney. I zoomed in on the signatures. My father's bold, looping script and my mother's tight, precise cursive were right there at the bottom of the page. The document granted Trey broad and unchecked legal authority to execute financial transactions on their behalf. He had likely buried this form in a stack of legitimate paperwork, perhaps telling them it was a routine document necessary to finalize his supposedly generous payoff of their mortgage. They trusted him implicitly, so they signed it blindly, handing over the legal keys to their most valuable asset without asking a single question. Armed with that power of attorney, Trey had walked into a branch of a major national bank and executed a devastating financial maneuver. He did not pay off a dime of the remaining balance. Instead, he used the completely paid-down equity of the historic Tudor mansion as collateral to open a massive home equity line of credit. The principal amount on the approval document stared back at me in stark black and white. $450,000. Trey had literally mortgaged his parents' shelter to line his own pockets, leveraging decades of their hard work to secure a massive cash injection for himself. But a loan of that size requires disbursement, and banks keep meticulous records of where their money goes. I opened the wire transfer logs attached to the account. The funds had not been parked in a conservative high-yield savings account or used for legitimate venture capital backing. The money had been aggressively drained in a matter of weeks through a series of rapid and reckless wire transfers. I tracked the first major outbound wire, $95,000 sent directly to a Tesla dealership. I pulled up a secondary screen and opened social media, navigating to Harper's public profile to cross-reference the dates. November 12th showed the wire transfer to the dealership. November 14th showed Harper posting a picture holding a Tesla steering wheel with the caption boasting about how her successful husband always treats her like a queen. She had been driving around Atlanta in a luxury vehicle funded entirely by my parents' stolen equity. The spending spree only grew more grotesque from there. I traced a $30,000 transfer to a luxury travel concierge service. This perfectly aligned with the extravagant 2-week vacation Trey and Harper took to Dubai last winter. They had flooded their social networks with pictures of themselves sipping champagne on private yachts and dining at 5-star restaurants in the sky, captioning the photos with quotes about hard work and building an empire. They had funded their entire influencer lifestyle by secretly bleeding my parents dry. But the cars and luxury vacations were just a fraction of the theft. The vast majority of the $450,000 had been wired in massive panicked chunks to various offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. I recognized the specific platforms he had used. These were not regulated institutional investment portals. They were the highly leveraged, unregulated digital equivalent of back-alley casinos. Trey had bought into highly volatile decentralized tokens right at the absolute peak of the market bubble. When the market inevitably crashed, he clearly panicked. The subsequent wire transfers showed him doubling down, using the remaining loan funds to try and catch a falling knife, desperately attempting to average down his catastrophic losses. He had gambled away over $250,000 on digital vaporware, completely obliterating the loan funds in less than 3 months. The market had liquidated his margin positions entirely. The money was simply gone, absorbed by the blockchain, never to be recovered. When the stolen money evaporated, the monthly interest payments on the loan suddenly became his responsibility. The payment history log was the final nail in the coffin. Trey had managed to make the minimum interest-only payments for exactly 2 months, using the very last remaining scraps of the stolen funds. After that, the ledger went completely blank. $0 had been credited to the account for 14 consecutive months. The bank had issued late notices, default warnings, and pre-foreclosure alerts. Trey, holding the power of attorney and likely routing all the bank correspondence directly to his own address, had hidden every single warning from my parents. He let the interest compound, let the late fees stack up, and watched in silence as the bank initiated the legal process to seize the Cascade mansion. I sat in the silent glow of my monitors, the full magnitude of his betrayal settling over me. My parents had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of superiority and wealth. They had poured all their love, resources, and pride into a son they believed was a financial genius. They had mocked my legitimate career and called me a burden, entirely convinced that Trey was the one protecting the family legacy. In reality, their golden child was a broke, desperate scammer who had stolen their home out from under them to fund a fake lifestyle and cover his gambling debts. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. They had sacrificed their actual financial security for the illusion of it, and the architect of their ruin was the very son they praised. The red flashing indicator on the bank portal was not a suggestion, it was a countdown. I stared at the digital calendar attached to the foreclosure file. The county auction was scheduled for the second Tuesday of April. That gave my parents exactly 82 days before the bank legally seized the property and the county sheriff arrived to physically remove them from the premises. 82 days until the heavy mahogany doors of the historic Tudor mansion were padlocked by a court order. 82 days until their wealthy neighbors in Cascade watched their antique furniture being hauled out onto the perfectly manicured lawn. I sat back in the silence of my penthouse, visualizing the sheer magnitude of their impending public humiliation. My parents had built their entire identities around their zip code and their perceived generational wealth. They hosted elaborate garden parties and high-profile charity galas and flawless holiday dinners specifically to showcase their unshakable social standing. Homelessness was not just a financial crisis for them, it was the complete and total destruction of their social currency, and they were entirely oblivious. Right at this very moment, my mother was probably polishing the expensive silver, and my father was probably bragging to his golf buddies about his brilliant venture capitalist son. They were sleeping soundly in a house they no longer owned, while the son they worshipped was actively ignoring the aggressive legal notices piling up in a hidden post office box. My first instinct, the ingrained emotional response of a daughter raised to fix things, was to pick up my phone. I could call my father right now, wake him up, and expose the entire fraud. I could send them the PDF files and the wire transfer receipts proving that Trey had robbed them blind. But my hand never moved toward the phone. I remembered the absolute disgust in my mother's voice when she called me a burden. I remembered my father slamming his heavy hand on the dining table, demanding I stop interrogating his golden boy. If I called them, they would not believe me. Trey would immediately spin a complex lie about bank errors and corporate sabotage. He would gaslight them into believing I had hacked the financial system out of pure jealousy just to ruin his flawless reputation. And even if they did believe me, their first reaction would not be gratitude or apologies. Their first reaction would be absolute entitlement. They would demand that I use my corporate salary to bail out their beloved son and quietly fix the mess to save the family name. They would expect me to absorb the $450,000 loss simply because I was the unmarried daughter with no other obligations. I refused to play that role ever again. I was not going to be their financial shield. I was not going to let them use my hard-earned success to cover up his spectacular failure. If I warned them, Trey would find a way to escape accountability. He would manipulate them into selling the house quietly, or taking on even more predatory debt to cover his tracks. The only way to ensure the absolute truth came out to ensure that Trey faced the severe reality of his financial crimes was to let the foreclosure process continue exactly as the bank intended. But I was not going to let a random hedge fund or an anonymous real estate flipper take control of my family's legacy. I was going to buy the debt myself. The next morning, I walked into my corner office and immediately bypassed my standard daily workflow. I contacted a private wealth management firm that specialized in high net worth asset protection. Within 48 hours, I established a completely anonymous holding company. I named the blind LLC Onyx Horizon Holdings. It was legally registered in Delaware, a state with aggressive corporate privacy laws that completely shielded the identities of the managing members. My name would not appear on any public registry, any tax document, or any ownership deed. To the outside world, Onyx Horizon Holdings was just another faceless private equity entity, aggressively acquiring distressed real estate in the Atlanta area. But in reality, it was a precision legal weapon built entirely with my corporate bonus money. To execute the transaction without raising any compliance red flags within my own firm, I retained the services of an independent attorney. Marcus was a cutthroat real estate lawyer based in downtown Atlanta who specialized in aggressive debt acquisition and corporate takeovers. He did not ask personal questions or care about family drama. He only cared about the retainer fee and the legality of the binding contracts. I sat across from him in his high-rise office and handed him the thick file. I instructed him to approach the National Bank holding my parents' defaulted equity line and make a direct cash offer to purchase the specific promissory note and the corresponding deed of trust. Commercial banks absolutely detest the lengthy, expensive process of legal foreclosures. They always prefer instant liquidity, especially right at the end of a fiscal quarter. When Marcus presented them with a certified wire transfer covering the entire outstanding principal and all the accumulated late fees, the bank eagerly agreed to assign the debt to Onyx Horizon Holdings. I authorized the massive release of funds directly from my private accounts. The money I had earned through grueling negotiations and flawless market analysis was wired directly to the institutional lender. It took exactly 14 days for the complex legal paperwork to clear the county recording office. By the end of the second week, Marcus sent me a secured encrypted email containing the finalized assignment of the deed. I opened the attachment and read the fine print. The trap was officially set. I had completely bypassed the traditional auction process. Onyx Horizon Holdings was now the sole legal creditor of the historic Cascade property. I owned the mortgage. I owned the late fees. I owned the absolute right to foreclose. My parents and my brother still thought they were dealing with a massive, slow-moving national bank that they could potentially dodge or negotiate with. They had no idea that the bank was already gone. Their new landlord, their sole judge and jury, was the very daughter they had thrown out on Thanksgiving Day. I closed the laptop and looked out over the Atlanta skyline. The ticking clock had not stopped. I had simply taken control of the detonator. The silence from my family lasted exactly 28 days. It was broken on a Tuesday morning in mid-December. I was sitting in my glass-walled office reviewing quarterly projections when my personal phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. It was a text message from my mother. It did not start with a greeting or a question about my well-being. It was a direct imperial command. Come home for Christmas dinner on the 24th. I have spoken with your brother, and I will allow you to apologize to Trey for your disgraceful behavior at Thanksgiving. Do not make this harder than it needs to be, Nia. Family is family, and you need us. I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer audacity of her words was almost impressive. She was standing on the deck of a sinking ship, offering me a ticket to the boiler room while demanding I thank her for the privilege. My initial thought was to simply block the number again and let the foreclosure process blindside them in the spring. But as I read the message a second time, a cold, calculated realization washed over me. I was no longer the banished daughter. I was the private investor holding a $450,000 hammer over their lives. I wanted to see it. I needed to see exactly how deep the delusion ran. I wanted to sit in my own house and watch the architect of their ruin pretend to be their savior. I typed a simple two-word reply. I will be there. Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter chill that swept through the Atlanta streets. I stood in the massive walk-in closet of my penthouse selecting my armor. At Thanksgiving, my mother had mocked my tailored corporate suit. Tonight, I was not dressing for a board meeting. I was dressing like the apex predator of the food chain. I chose a custom emerald green velvet dress that draped perfectly in homage to the wealth they only pretended to possess. I paired it with diamond stud earrings that I had purchased in Paris the year before and a pair of Christian Louboutin heels. I did not look like a woman desperate for family approval. I looked exactly like what I was. A multimillionaire stepping out for a casual evening of pure entertainment. The drive to the Cascade neighborhood felt entirely different this time. I was not driving toward a trial or a judgment. I was conducting a site inspection. As I pulled my black sedan up the long brick driveway, the historic Tudor mansion was ablaze with holiday lights. An absurdly large imported fir tree glowed violently through the front bay window. The display of manufactured wealth was nauseating, knowing the bank had not received a single cent of interest in over a year. I walked up the steps, the red soles of my heels clicking sharply against the stone. I did not bother knocking. I turned the brass knob and pushed the heavy door open, stepping into the grand foyer. The house smelled of expensive pine needles and roasted lamb. Classical music drifted from the living room, mingling with the sound of clinking crystal. I handed my cashmere coat to the housekeeper, who offered a warm, genuine smile, the only real greeting I would receive all night. I stepped into the main living area. My mother, Vivian, was standing by the fireplace holding a glass of champagne. She wore a heavy silk dress and a diamond necklace that I knew was purchased on credit. Her eyes locked onto me, scanning my outfit. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of raw, unadulterated envy cross her face before she hastily replaced it with a mask of maternal condescension. "Well," she said, her voice carrying over the music, "you actually showed up. And you finally decided to wear something resembling feminine attire. I suppose miracles do happen on Christmas." I did not flinch. I did not defend my wardrobe or explain my presence. I simply walked over to the serving tray, poured myself a generous glass of imported sparkling water, and turned to face the room. "Merry Christmas, Mother," I replied, my tone perfectly hollow. The room was staged flawlessly. My father Desmond was sitting in his usual leather armchair holding court. And there in the center of the room was Trey. He was wearing an absolutely ridiculous velvet smoking jacket, swirling a snifter of cognac, like he was the lord of the manor. Harper was draped over the arm of his chair, wearing a massive new diamond tennis bracelet that was undoubtedly funded by the very home equity line of credit I now legally possessed. Trey looked up and offered a smug, condescending smirk. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence," he sneered, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Have you humbled yourself yet, Nia? Are you ready to admit you were entirely out of line at Thanksgiving?" The room went silent. My parents watched me with expectant, predatory eyes. They were waiting for the apology. They were waiting for me to bend the knee to the golden child. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. The irony of the situation was intoxicating. I was standing in a living room that my company legally owned, looking at a fraudster demanding an apology for a crime he had committed against the very people defending him. I did not offer the apology. Instead, I smiled. A sharp, terrifyingly calm smile that caused Harper to shift uncomfortably. "I am just here to observe Trey," I said quietly, letting my eyes wander around the expensive crown molding of the ceiling. I wanted to see how everyone was holding up. "You have a lovely home. It would be an absolute tragedy if anything happened to it." My father frowned, clearly confused by my calm demeanor. "Nothing is going to happen to this house, Nia," he barked defensively. "Your brother secured this estate for generations to come. Sit down and show some respect." I took a seat on the velvet sofa, crossing my legs elegantly. For the next 3 hours, I barely spoke a word. I simply watched the illusion play out. I watched Harper boast about her upcoming luxury ski trip, completely unaware that her financial runway was rapidly shrinking to zero. I watched my mother parade around the room, treating me like a ghost, while she praised Trey for every minor thought that popped into his head. I watched Trey sweat slightly under the collar every time the conversation vaguely approached the topic of real estate or the broader financial markets. I was the silent creditor sitting in the heart of their false empire. They thought they had successfully disciplined their wayward daughter. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply surveying my newly acquired real estate. The evening progressed to the formal dining room where the roasted lamb was served on my mother's finest bone china. I took my assigned seat at the far end of the table, deliberately placing myself out of the direct line of fire. As the wine flowed, the volume in the room steadily increased, and Trey's manufactured confidence swelled. Halfway through the main course, Harper reached into her designer handbag and dramatically produced a stack of thick, glossy brochures. She tossed them onto the center of the table right next to the crystal gravy boat. "We did not want to steal the spotlight tonight," Harper announced, her voice dripping with artificial humility. "But Trey and I just received the preliminary renderings for our new vacation property. We are closing on a stunning modern build in Miami, right on the water in South Beach. 5 bedrooms, an infinity pool, and private dock access." My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest, as if overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of their success. "Oh, Harper, that is magnificent," she crooned, reaching for one of the brochures. "A vacation home in South Beach. You two are simply unstoppable." My father Desmond beamed, taking a brochure and examining the high-definition architectural mock-ups with profound reverence. He adjusted his reading glasses and nodded slowly. "This is prime real estate, Trey. Waterfront property in Florida is a phenomenal asset class. You are making all the right moves, son. Setting up the next generation for absolute financial dominance. My father carefully placed the brochure back on the table and turned his attention directly to me. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by the familiar critical glare he reserved only for his daughter. You should take notes, Nia, he lectured, pointing a stern finger in my direction. You spend 80 hours a week locked in a corporate office making other people rich while your brother is out here executing massive plays. You are so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that you are completely missing the bigger picture. True wealth is not a salary. True wealth is leverage and asset acquisition. If you humbled yourself, you might actually learn a thing or two from his financial genius. I sliced a piece of lamb, placing my fork down silently. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. My father was lecturing me about leverage and asset acquisition while sitting in a house that I legally possessed because his financial genius son had illegally leveraged it into oblivion. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin and offered a polite deferential nod. You are absolutely right, Dad, I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any sarcasm. Asset acquisition requires brilliant timing and immense liquidity, which actually makes me quite curious. I turned my gaze directly to Trey, locking eyes with him across the long table. Trey, I said, leaning forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. A waterfront property in Miami requires a massive cash down payment, especially in this current high interest rate environment. How exactly are you structuring that liquidity right now? I read the latest market reports this morning, and the decentralized finance sector is facing a catastrophic contagion event. The major algorithmic stablecoins have completely depegged, and the primary offshore exchanges are freezing user withdrawals due to massive insolvency issues. With the crypto market experiencing a historic trillion-dollar wipeout this week, how are you managing to pull that much clean capital out of the blockchain without triggering a devastating margin call? The effect of my words was instantaneous and violent. Trey stopped chewing. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the warm glow of the dining room chandelier. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He reached up and tugged violently at the collar of his velvet smoking jacket as if the fabric was suddenly strangling him. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out except a sharp, panicked breath. Harper looked at him, her perfectly manicured eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "Baby, what is she talking about?" Harper asked, her voice losing its arrogant edge. "Is there a problem with the crypto money? We already put down the non-refundable deposit for the architect." Trey shot a terrified glance at his wife before turning his wide, panicked eyes back to me. "No," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "No, there is no problem. Nia does not know what she is talking about. She reads traditional banking propaganda. The blockchain is entirely insulated from these minor market corrections. It is a temporary liquidity crunch caused by institutional whales manipulating the order books. My assets are locked in cold storage staking pools. It is totally fine." He reached for his wine glass, but his hand was trembling so violently that the red wine sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white tablecloth. He quickly set it down, grabbing his linen napkin to dab at the sweat that had suddenly broken out across his forehead. I did not break eye contact. I sat perfectly still, holding his gaze and letting the suffocating weight of my macroeconomic vocabulary crush him. I knew exactly what exchanges he had used. I knew his margin positions had been liquidated weeks ago. I knew he did not have a single dollar left to his name, let alone the capital for a Miami waterfront mansion. "I am so relieved to hear that, Trey," I said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. "Because the federal regulators are stepping in to audit those exact offshore pools next month. It would be a terrible shame if your massive venture profits were tied up in a federal insolvency investigation while you were trying to close on a 5-bedroom house in South Beach. But since you are a financial genius, I am sure you have already hedged your positions flawlessly." My mother slammed her hand down on the table, rattling the silverware. "Stop interrogating your brother, Nia," she snapped, her voice shrill and defensive. You come into this house on Christmas Eve and immediately try to ruin the mood with your depressing corporate jargon. You just cannot stand to see him happy. You cannot stand that he is buying a second home while you are sitting alone in some apartment. I smiled warmly at my mother. I am not interrogating him, Mom, I replied softly. I am simply taking notes from the master just like Dad suggested. I want to understand how the golden child operates. I leaned back in my chair completely satisfied. The psychological warfare had been executed flawlessly. For the rest of the evening, Trey was a ghost. He barely touched his food. He excused himself from the table 3 times to make frantic, hushed phone calls in the hallway. He drank excessively, pouring glass after glass of bourbon to steady his trembling hands. Harper sensed the shift in his energy and spent the remainder of the night quietly scrolling through her phone, the glossy Miami brochures completely forgotten on the table. My parents remained entirely oblivious to his panic, continuing to praise his phantom successes. But I saw the truth. The illusion was cracking under the weight of its own impossibility. The golden boy was suffocating in his velvet jacket, and I had not even dropped the real hammer yet. The suffocating tension I had introduced at the dining table did not dissipate when the plates were finally cleared. If anything, it thickened, spreading through the historic house like a slow-moving fog. Trey remained entirely mute, staring blankly at the mahogany table while his leg bounced nervously under the linen cloth. Harper, however, was visibly seething. She was not used to her husband being verbally cornered, and she was absolutely furious that her grand Miami real estate announcement had been entirely eclipsed by my financial questioning. She needed to reassert control. She needed to humiliate me to restore the delicate hierarchy of the family, where she and Trey were the unquestioned royalty, and I was the miserable outcast. We migrated back to the main living room for coffee and after-dinner drinks. The massive imported fir tree continued to glow aggressively in the corner, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. I took a seat on the velvet armchair positioned perfectly near the doorway. I had gathered all the intelligence I needed. The illusion was completely fractured, and I was simply waiting for the polite window to make my final exit. Harper walked over to the crystal decanter on the antique bar cart. Instead of pouring coffee, she filled a massive balloon glass to the brim with a dark, heavy Cabernet Sauvignon. She gripped the stem of the glass, her knuckles turning slightly white, and locked her eyes on me. I saw the calculation in her gaze before she even took her first step. It was the classic maneuver of a cornered bully looking for a cheap victory. She crossed the living room floor, walking directly toward my chair. There were no rugs to trip over. There were no obstacles in her path. The hardwood floor was perfectly level. Yet when she was exactly 2 feet away from me, she executed a flawless theatrical stumble. She let out a sharp manufactured gasp, throwing her arms forward. The heavy balloon glass tipped violently. A massive wave of dark crimson wine splashed directly onto my lap, soaking instantly into the fabric of my custom silk suit. The cold liquid seeped through the luxurious material, staining it permanently and dripping down the legs of my trousers onto my expensive leather heels. The crystal glass shattered against the hardwood floor, sending sharp shards in every direction. The living room plunged into a stunned, breathless silence. The classical music playing softly in the background suddenly felt entirely out of place. I did not jump up. I did not scream. I looked down at the dark red stain spreading aggressively across my lap, ruining a garment that cost more than Harper's first car. Then I looked up at her. Harper pressed her manicured hand against her chest, feigning absolute shock. "Oh my goodness, Nia," she exclaimed, her voice pitched high with fake distress. "I am so clumsy tonight. I completely lost my footing in these heels. I am so sorry." She paused, letting a small, cruel smirk play at the corners of her mouth as her eyes dragged over my ruined clothing. "But do not worry too much. It is just clothes. I am sure you can find a perfectly fine replacement at a discount store somewhere in the city. Maybe even on clearance, since the holidays are almost over." It was a masterclass in microaggressions. A deliberate physical attack wrapped in a condescending insult designed specifically to remind me of my supposed financial inferiority. She wanted me to explode. She wanted me to stand up and scream at her so she could play the terrified victim. Before I could even take a breath to respond, my mother Vivian immediately jumped into the fray. She did not ask if I was all right. She did not offer a towel or club soda to mitigate the stain. She instantly moved to protect her daughter-in-law. "Nia, do not you dare make a scene!" Vivian commanded, her voice sharp and authoritative, pointing a warning finger in my direction. It was clearly an accident. Harper just said she was sorry. Do not let your bitter attitude ruin our Christmas Eve. Go to the powder room and clean yourself up, and then come back out here with a better disposition. This family has been through enough of your drama for 1 year. I sat perfectly still, surrounded by the shattered crystal and the smell of spilled alcohol. I looked at my mother desperately defending a woman who was actively draining her retirement funds. I looked at Trey cowering by the fireplace, too terrified of his own financial reality to even speak. And I looked at Harper standing over me, brimming with arrogant satisfaction, thinking she had just won a massive victory by ruining a piece of silk. They were all completely pathetic, and they were all completely mine. I slowly stood up, the damp silk clinging uncomfortably to my skin. I did not break eye contact with Harper. I did not rush to the powder room to scrub at the stain like an obedient child. I simply smoothed the lapels of my ruined jacket and smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was a terrifyingly calm, clinical smile. The kind of smile a predator gives right before the trap violently snaps shut. The smirk on Harper's face instantly faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. She had expected rage. She had expected tears. She had absolutely no defense for total unbothered amusement. "Enjoy the wine, Harper," I said, my voice low, smooth, and echoing clearly in the quiet room. "Because it is going to be a very dry year." I did not wait for her to process the words. I did not wait for my mother to issue another ridiculous command. I stepped carefully over the broken glass and walked straight out of the living room. I retrieved my cashmere coat from the silent, wide-eyed housekeeper in the foyer. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the freezing December night. I walked down the brick driveway to my car, leaving the fake warmth of the historic mansion behind me. The suit was ruined, but I did not care. It was a minor casualty in a much larger war. I started my engine and drove away, knowing with absolute certainty that this was the very last time I would ever step foot in that house as a guest. The next time I walked through those mahogany doors, I would be the landlord. At exactly 8 o'clock on the first business morning following the holiday weekend, I stepped out of the private elevator and into the sleek glass-walled lobby of my attorney's downtown firm. The ruined silk suit from Christmas Eve was already sitting at the bottom of a luxury dumpster, replaced by a razor-sharp charcoal pinstripe blazer and perfectly tailored trousers. I carried absolutely no resentment from the spilled wine or the pathetic insults. I only carried my leather briefcase, my bank authorization codes, and a profound sense of clarity. Marcus was waiting for me in his corner conference room. The massive mahogany table was entirely clear, except for a thick, perfectly aligned stack of legal documents and a steaming cup of black coffee. He did not waste time with small talk or holiday pleasantries. He knew exactly how much capital was moving today, and he treated the transaction with the clinical respect it deserved. "The institutional lender is incredibly eager to close this out before the end of their fiscal year," Marcus said, tapping the top of the file folder. "They have officially agreed to the full assignment of the promissory note and the deed of trust to Onyx Horizon Holdings. They are taking a slight haircut on the back-end penalties to secure the immediate liquidity, but the core principle remains fully intact. The moment you sign the wire authorization, the debt is completely severed from the national bank. Onyx Horizon Holdings becomes the sole, undisputed legal creditor." I took my seat in the heavy leather chair. I did not hesitate or ask for a moment to review the terms. I had already analyzed every single line of the contract over the weekend. I pulled out my own pen, a heavy gold-plated Mont Blanc I had purchased after closing my very first $1 million acquisition, and flipped directly to the signature pages. The paper was crisp. The blue ink flowed smoothly. With 3 deliberate aggressive strokes, I authorized the irrevocable release of $450,000 in pure liquid cash from my private accounts directly to the institutional lender. We sat in absolute silence while the wire transfer was processed through the Federal Reserve System. I sipped my black coffee looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. Somewhere in those affluent southwestern suburbs, my family was likely waking up, shaking off their holiday hangovers, and continuing their theater of wealth. My mother was probably admiring the new diamond bracelet Harper had flaunted. My father was likely still glowing with pride over his son's fictional Miami real estate empire. And Trey was undoubtedly waking up in a cold sweat, paralyzed by the sheer terror of his impending financial collapse. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their foundation was currently being rerouted through a secure banking server miles away. 20 minutes later, Marcus's computer pinged with a sharp, distinct chime. He refreshed his secure banking portal and a tight, predatory smile crossed his face. "Funds received and verified by the clearinghouse," Marcus announced, turning the flat-screen monitor toward me so I could see the digital confirmation. "The bank has executed the release. The assignment of the deed of trust has been officially recorded and time-stamped with the county clerk. The original lender is now entirely out of the picture." He reached into the file folder and slid a single heavily embossed piece of paper across the mahogany table. It was the formalized assignment of deed of trust, the absolute legal title to their debt. I reached out and rested my fingertips on the raised county seal. A profound seismic shift in power crystallized in the quiet conference room. The historic Cascade mansion, the absolute crown jewel of my parents' manufactured legacy, no longer belonged to a faceless corporate banking institution. It belonged to Onyx Horizon Holdings. It belonged to me. I was now the sole arbiter of their financial destiny. The terms of the power dynamic had been violently reversed. If they missed another payment, I was the one who would issue the default notice. If they failed to cure the outstanding debt, I was the one who possessed the absolute legal authority to seize the property, auction the estate, and order the county sheriff to execute their eviction. I literally held the keys to the kingdom they had banished me from. My mother had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, weaponizing her home and treating my presence as a burden she only begrudgingly tolerated. Trey had stolen their equity to buy luxury cars and fake a billionaire lifestyle he could never genuinely afford, parading around their country club like a self-made titan. They had built an impenetrable fortress of arrogance on a foundation of absolute quicksand. And now, with a few strokes of a pen, I had legally purchased the quicksand. "What are our immediate next steps regarding the default?" Marcus asked, folding his hands over his legal pad and pulling me back to the present. "Given that the account is already 14 months in arrears, we possess the legal right to initiate formal foreclosure proceedings immediately. We can have a notice taped to their front door by tomorrow morning." "No," I replied softly, carefully sliding the embossed deed into my leather briefcase and snapping the brass locks shut. "Cancel the bank's original April auction date. Let them breathe for just a little while longer." Marcus raised an eyebrow, silently questioning the delay, but he simply nodded. "I want Trey to exhaust every single lie he has left," I explained, standing up and buttoning my charcoal blazer. "When the National Bank stops returning his frantic phone calls, and when the automated portal completely shuts him out, the paranoia will set in. He will realize that the debt has been sold to a private entity, but he will have absolutely no idea who is actually holding the leash. Let him sweat. Let him scramble in the dark, trying to find a ghost." I shook Marcus's hand and walked out of the conference room. The shift in the universe was palpable as I rode the elevator down to the lobby. I had walked into that building as a daughter who had been repeatedly humiliated, underestimated, and discarded. I was walking out as the undisputed hidden matriarch of the family's legacy. The trap was locked, loaded, and completely inescapable. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the golden child to finally run out of runway. 6 months had passed since the Thanksgiving disaster. The sweltering Atlanta summer was just beginning to settle over the affluent Cascade neighborhood. The manicured lawns were vibrant green, and the blooming azaleas masked the quiet desperation brewing behind the walls of the historic Tudor mansion. I knew exactly how the illusion finally shattered because Marcus, my attorney, forwarded me the time-stamped affidavit of service the moment it was executed. It was a perfectly mundane Tuesday morning when a plain white sedan parked at the edge of my parents' long brick driveway. A man in a cheap gray suit stepped out holding a clipboard and a thick stack of neon yellow legal documents. He did not look like the usual delivery drivers or landscapers that service the elite neighborhood. He walked with the brisk mechanical efficiency of someone who delivered catastrophes for a living. He marched directly up the front steps, pulled out a roll of heavy-duty packing tape, and secured the notice of foreclosure directly onto the varnished mahogany of the front door. He snapped a date-stamped photograph of the taped document for his legal records, turned around, and drove away. My mother, Vivian, was the one who found it. She had opened the front door to retrieve a package from a luxury boutique, completely unprepared for the aggressive yellow paper blocking her path. The bold black letters screamed the reality she had been entirely shielded from. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. She ripped the tape off the wood, her hands trembling violently as her eyes scanned the legal jargon. The document explicitly stated that a home equity line of credit was in catastrophic default. The principal balance listed was $450,000. The document warned that the property would be seized and sold at public auction to satisfy the massive delinquent debt. Vivian let out a sharp, breathless gasp, dropping her boutique package onto the porch. She ran back inside, screaming my father's name, her voice cracking with a level of sheer panic that had never before echoed through their pristine home. Desmond rushed into the foyer, still holding his morning coffee. He snatched the crumpled yellow document from her shaking hands. As he read the staggering financial figures, the color completely drained from his face. His authoritative posture collapsed. He stared at the numbers, trying to comprehend how a house he had spent 30 years paying off was suddenly carrying nearly $500,000 in toxic debt. He read the words "power of attorney" referenced in the default clauses, and the agonizing truth began to claw at the edges of his mind. But the human brain will do everything in its power to reject a reality that completely destroys its worldview. Instead of accepting that his golden child had robbed them blind, Desmond immediately dialed Trey's number, his fingers slipping nervously against the screen. He demanded Trey come to the house immediately. Trey arrived less than 20 minutes later, screeching his luxury SUV into the driveway. He walked through the front door, trying to project his usual arrogant swagger, but his eyes were darting frantically. He knew exactly what that yellow paper meant. He had spent the last 2 months dodging aggressive phone calls and ignoring certified mail, hoping he could somehow spin another miraculous lie. Desmond was pacing the living room floor, the notice of foreclosure clutched tightly in his fist. Vivian was sitting on the velvet sofa, weeping into her hands, terrified that her country club friends would drive by and see a foreclosure notice plastered to her front door. "What is this?" Trey, Desmond demanded, his voice booming with a mixture of raw terror and desperate hope. "What is this piece of paper? It says we owe $450,000. It says our house is being auctioned. You told us you paid off the mortgage. You told us we were secure. Explain this to me right now." Trey did not miss a beat. He relied on the one weapon that had successfully shielded him his entire life, which was their absolute blind faith in his superiority. He let out a loud theatrical sigh, running his hands over his face, as if he was exhausted by the sheer incompetence of the world around him. He walked over to Desmond and gently took the foreclosure notice from his hand, glancing at it with manufactured disgust. "Dad, you need to calm down," Trey said, his voice smooth and dripping with patronizing reassurance. "I told you the traditional banking system is broken. This is exactly why I moved my capital into decentralized finance. This entire document is a massive clerical error. It is a glitch in their automated underwriting system." A glitch. Desmond repeated, his voice trembling. A glitch does not threaten to auction my house, Trey. A glitch does not say you took out a massive line of credit in my name. Trey stepped closer, placing a firm, comforting hand on his father's shoulder. Dad listened to me carefully. When I executed the massive wire transfer to pay off your mortgage, their legacy servers flagged the transaction because of the sheer volume of the capital. It triggered an automated security protocol that accidentally reversed the payoff code and generated a phantom line of credit on their back-end ledgers. It is a known software bug affecting thousands of accounts nationwide. My wealth management team has been dealing with this for weeks. Vivian looked up from her hands, her tear-streaked face desperate for a lifeline. So we are not losing the house, she whispered. Of course not, Mom Trey scoffed, rolling his eyes as if the very idea was ridiculous. I have my corporate lawyers tearing the bank apart right now. We are actually preparing a massive defamation lawsuit against them for sending a process server and causing you this emotional distress. They are going to owe us millions when my legal team is done with them. But you have to let me handle it. Do not call the bank. Do not call any customer service numbers. If you reach out to them, it will cross the wires and complicate the active litigation. Let my attorneys fix their clerical error. It was a brilliant sociopathic performance. He buried his theft under a mountain of aggressive corporate buzzwords and false promises of litigation. He weaponized their lack of financial literacy against them. And because the alternative was admitting that their perfect son was a criminal who had destroyed their lives, Desmond and Vivian swallowed the lie completely. They chose the comfortable delusion over the terrifying reality. Desmond nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with immense relief. He patted Trey's arm, thanking him for being so diligent. Vivian wiped her tears, praising God for blessing them with such a smart, capable son. They went to sleep that night, believing the nightmare was just a software glitch. They had absolutely no idea that their golden child was out of time and the silent creditor holding the actual deed was watching the clock run out. The days following the delivery of the foreclosure notice dragged by with agonizing slowness. Vivian had immediately ripped the neon yellow paper into tiny shreds and thrown it into the kitchen trash can, as if destroying the physical document could magically erase the legal reality. For the first week, my parents clung desperately to Trey's fabricated lie. They went about their daily routines with a forced, hollow cheerfulness. Vivian continued to water her orchids and attend her weekly charity committee meetings, pretending her world was perfectly intact. Desmond spent his afternoons at the country club, aggressively steering the conversation away from the real estate market. But the fear was a living, breathing thing inside that house. It crept into the quiet moments. Every time the doorbell rang or a heavy truck drove past the front window, my mother would physically flinch, expecting the county sheriff to be standing on the porch with a padlock. Trey had essentially vanished. He stopped dropping by for unannounced dinners, and his phone went straight to voicemail. When he did occasionally text, it was always a vague, rushed message claiming he was locked in endless arbitration meetings with his corporate attorneys and the bank executives. He told them the situation was highly classified and forbade them from interfering. But as the third week approached and the calendar in the kitchen inched terrifyingly close to the April auction date, the fragile facade completely broke. Desmond could no longer endure the suffocating anxiety. The pride that had kept him blindly obedient to his golden child finally cracked under the sheer primal instinct of survival. Early one Thursday morning, while Vivian was out getting her hair styled, Desmond locked himself inside his mahogany-paneled study. He pulled the shredded pieces of the foreclosure notice out of the trash and taped them back together just enough to read the customer service number for the National Bank. He picked up the heavy receiver of his desk phone and dialed. He navigated the infuriating automated menu for 20 minutes, punching in his social security number and the property zip code with trembling fingers. When the system finally connected him to a human representative in the loan mitigation department, Desmond tried to deploy his usual authoritative tone. He demanded to speak with the senior executive handling the software glitch on his mortgage account. He loudly threatened to unleash his son's legal team if the bank did not immediately send a letter of apology clearing his family name. The representative on the other end of the line remained entirely silent for several seconds before typing rapidly on her keyboard. "Sir," the representative said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "There is no software glitch on this file. This account is not under active litigation. In fact, this bank no longer holds any interest in this property whatsoever. Your son took out a $450,000 equity line of credit that went completely unpaid for 14 consecutive months. The asset was classified as a total loss." Desmond gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are the bank. You sent the notice to my door." "We sent the initial default warnings, yes," the representative replied smoothly. "But last month, our institution sold your defaulted debt portfolio to a private equity firm. The account was purchased in full by an entity called Onyx Horizon Holdings. We do not own your mortgage anymore, sir. Onyx Horizon Holdings is your sole creditor. They hold the deed of trust and they are the ones legally executing the foreclosure auction." Desmond felt the blood drain completely from his head. "Give me their phone number," he ordered, panic finally bleeding through his authoritative mask. "Give me the contact information for this Onyx company right now. I need to speak to their manager." "I cannot do that, sir," the representative stated flatly. "Onyx Horizon Holdings is a blind LLC. We have absolutely no contact information for their managing partners or their executives. All communication was handled through a third-party corporate attorney. You are entirely at their mercy. Have a good day, sir." The line went dead. Desmond sat in his leather chair, listening to the dial tone echo in his quiet study. The truth crashed down on him with the force of a falling building. There were no corporate lawyers fighting for them. There was no massive crypto fortune. Trey had looked him dead in the eye and lied while their family legacy was sold off to a faceless corporate ghost. They were weeks away from being thrown onto the street, and they had absolutely no way to stop it. The realization shattered the entire dynamic of the household. When Vivian returned home, Desmond forced her to sit down and broke the news. The screaming that followed echoed through the heavy walls of the Tudor mansion. Vivian collapsed onto the floor, weeping hysterically, her perfect country club image completely obliterated. But the most revealing reaction came from Harper. Because Trey had completely run out of money to pay the rent on their luxury high-rise apartment, he and Harper had quietly moved into the guest bedroom of the Cascade house, under the guise of being close to the family during this stressful legal battle. The moment Harper heard the screaming and realized that the money was truly gone, she did not offer comfort. She did not stand by her husband. She went straight into self-preservation mode. Harper marched up this grand staircase and began violently pulling her designer clothes out of the mahogany armoire. She dragged 3 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases onto the guest bed and started throwing her shoes and silk dresses inside. Trey walked into the room begging her to calm down, promising he just needed a few days to secure a bridge loan from a new investor. "Do not touch me," Harper snapped, slapping his hand away as she zipped her makeup bag. "There is no investor, Trey. You are completely broke and your parents are about to be homeless. I cannot deal with this kind of toxic energy. My mental health is absolutely deteriorating in this negative environment. I am going to stay at my mother's house in Buckhead until you figure out how to provide for me the way you promised." She did not care about the generational wealth or the family legacy. She only cared that the bank account was finally empty. Harper dragged her heavy suitcases past my weeping mother, and my catatonic father walked out the front door and ordered a premium rideshare. She left Trey standing in the wreckage of the lies he had created entirely alone. The walls had completely closed in, and there was no one left to blame. My phone buzzed against the marble kitchen island. I was standing in my penthouse watching the afternoon traffic crawl along Peachtree Street. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed my father's name. It was the very first time he had reached out to me since the Thanksgiving dinner 6 months ago. I did not immediately pick up. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the complete reversal of power before I finally swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited. Nia, his voice barked through the speaker. There was no greeting. There was no inquiry about how I was doing. There was not a single ounce of an apology for the way he and my mother had treated me. His voice was frantic, breathless, and dripping with the exact same entitlement he had wielded my entire life. Nia, you need to listen to me right now, Desmond commanded, his words rushing together in a panicked blur. You work in high-level finance. You understand these predatory corporate structures. The bank made a massive mistake with our deed, and now some faceless private equity firm called Onyx Horizon Holdings bought our debt. They are trying to steal the house. They put a foreclosure notice on my front door. You need to fix this paperwork right now. I leaned against the cool marble counter, holding the phone loosely. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. And how exactly do you expect me to fix it, Dad? I asked, my voice perfectly level. You need to pull $50,000 from your savings, Desmond demanded. His audacity was so pure it was almost breathtaking. You need to wire $50,000 to my account by tomorrow morning. I will use it to retain a premium litigation team and force this Onyx company into a legal injunction to stall the auction. Or we can use it to bribe the private investor to back off while Trey liquidates some of his assets. You have that kind of money sitting around, Nia. You owe this family. You owe us your support in a crisis. I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows, letting his ridiculous demands hang in the air. He had thrown me out of his house. He had allowed my mother to call me a burden. He had cheered while my brother mocked my career. And now, faced with total financial annihilation, his immediate instinct was to command me to empty my savings to save his pride. I am confused, Dad, I said, my voice deadpan and razor sharp. Why do not you ask your pride and joy? Did not Trey pay off the house with his massive crypto venture profits at Thanksgiving? There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing. I could hear the faint sound of my mother Vivian sobbing somewhere in the background of the Cascade house. Your brother is experiencing a temporary liquidity crunch, Desmond stammered, his booming voice finally fracturing. The market shifted. His capital is tied up in offshore accounts that he cannot legally access right now. We do not have time to wait for his funds to clear. This private firm is moving too fast. We are weeks away from being thrown onto the street, Nia. You have to step up. You are my daughter. He is not experiencing a liquidity crunch, Dad, I replied coldly, refusing to let him hide behind financial buzzwords. He is completely broke. You do not understand the situation, Desmond yelled, his desperation turning quickly back into anger. You always want to tear him down. He made a small miscalculation with a home equity line. The bank took advantage of him. A small miscalculation, I repeated, letting out a short, humorless laugh. He forged a power of attorney. He leveraged $450,000 of your paid-down equity to buy his wife a luxury car and go on vacation to Dubai. And then he gambled the rest away on unregulated digital coins. That is not a miscalculation. That is felony wire fraud and grand larceny. How do you know the exact amount? Desmond whispered, his voice suddenly very small. How do you know about the power of attorney? Because I actually work in finance, Dad, I answered smoothly. Because I know exactly how to pull a public property record. I know exactly how to track a defaulted loan. I knew he was lying the second he tapped his fork against his glass at Thanksgiving. But you did not want to hear it. You wanted the illusion. You wanted the golden child so badly that you handed him the keys to your entire life without asking a single question. Nia, please, Desmond begged, his voice cracking. The entitlement was finally completely gone, replaced by raw terror. I am your father. Vivian is your mother. We are going to lose everything. Our friends are standing our home. You cannot just abandon us. You have the money. Just loan us the $50,000. I swear Trey will pay you back when his investments turn around. We will put it in writing. He will never pay me back because he has absolutely no marketable skills and no capital, I said. And I'm not giving you a single dime. I could hear my mother screaming in the background, demanding to know what I was saying. Desmond was hyperventilating, practically choking on his own panic. If you do not help us, we are out on the street, Nia, he cried out. They are going to auction the house. A total stranger is going to buy our family legacy for pennies on the dollar and throw our belongings onto the lawn. You cannot let some faceless corporate monster take our home. I stood tall in the quiet luxury of my penthouse. The irony was absolute perfection. He was begging me to save him from a monster that I had created specifically for him. You made your choice 6 months ago, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. You chose your son. You chose his lies. You called me a burden and told me I was useless to this family. So I am going to do exactly what you raised me to do. I am going to mind my own business and focus on my boring corporate career. Good luck dealing with Onyx Horizon Holdings. I hear they are absolutely ruthless. Wait! Nia, do not hang up, Desmond screamed into the receiver. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button ending the call. I immediately opened my settings and blocked his number again. The silence returned to my apartment clean and absolute. The audacity of his phone call had only confirmed what I already knew. They felt no remorse. They only felt fear. They did not want to apologize to me. They just wanted to use me as a human shield to protect Trey from the consequences of his own actions. They were willing to drain my bank account to preserve their country club image. I walked over to the kitchen island and poured myself another glass of sparkling water. Let them scramble. Let them panic. Let them spend the next few weeks packing their boxes in absolute terror. The final blow was coming, and I was going to deliver it to them in person. My phone lit up again before I could even set it down on the marble counter. It was Desmond calling back. His panic was so visceral that he could not accept the dial tone as my final answer. I watched the screen flash for several seconds before I finally swiped the green icon and brought the phone back to my ear. I did not speak. I simply let the silence hang, waiting for him to exhaust his desperation. Nia, you cannot just hang up on me. Desmond gasped, his breath hitching heavily. You cannot drop a bomb like that and just walk away. What do you mean he forged a power of attorney? What do you mean he bought a car? You are not making any sense. You have to explain this to me right now. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air of the penthouse fill my lungs. I had tried to let them remain in the dark, but since he was actively demanding his own destruction, I decided to give him exactly what he asked for. I decided to give him the brutal, unvarnished truth, meticulously stripped of any emotional cushioning. Listen to me very carefully, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a clinical professional register. I am going to explain exactly how your son destroyed your life. 14 months ago, Trey brought you a stack of paperwork. He told you it was a routine confirmation to finalize the payoff of your mortgage. Mixed in with those papers was a general power of attorney. You and Mom signed it without reading it because you blindly trust him. He took that notarized document, walked into a branch of your national bank, and used it to bypass your physical presence. He used your fully paid down historic Tudor mansion as collateral to open a massive home equity line of credit. The bank approved a principal amount of $450,000 based on the appraisal of your property. Desmond let out a low, agonizing groan, but I did not stop. I did not offer any comfort. I was conducting a forensic financial autopsy over the phone. The moment the funds cleared, Trey began aggressively draining the account. I continued, my words striking like physical blows. He did not invest it in a legitimate venture capital fund. He wired $95,000 directly to a luxury dealership to purchase the Tesla that Harper has been driving around Buckhead. He wired $30,000 to a premium concierge service to fund their extravagant 2-week vacation in Dubai. And then he panicked. He took the remaining balance, over $250,000 in pure stolen equity, and wired it to unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. He bought highly leveraged digital assets right before the entire market collapsed. When the tokens crashed, his margin positions were completely liquidated. The money simply vanished into the blockchain. He lost every single cent of your home equity in less than 3 months. There was a heavy, crushing silence on the line. I could hear Desmond breathing erratically, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. And because he lost the money, I said, driving the final nail into the coffin, he could not make the monthly interest payments on the loan he took out in your name. He made the minimum payment for exactly 2 months before the account went completely dry. He has been hiding the bank notices from you for over a year. He gambled your home away, Dad. Every single brick of it is gone. Suddenly, the sound of Desmond's heavy breathing was violently interrupted by the sound of a physical struggle. I heard the phone clatter against a hard surface and Desmond shouting in surprise. Then a new voice pierced through the speaker. It was my mother, Vivian. She had clearly been listening in the background, and the cognitive dissonance of hearing her golden child exposed as a common criminal had pushed her completely over the edge into sheer narcissistic rage. "You are a liar!" Vivian shrieked into the receiver, her voice so loud and shrill that the audio violently distorted. I held the phone slightly away from my ear. "You are a jealous, malicious liar, Nia. I knew it. I knew you would try to do something like this." I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply waited. "You fabricated this entire story because you are miserable," Vivian screamed, her words rapid and venomous. "You have always hated your brother. You have always been insanely jealous of his success and his beautiful wife. You hacked into the banking system to create those fake documents just to ruin his flawless reputation. Trey would never do this to us. He is a good man. He is a visionary. You are just trying to destroy him because you are completely alone, and you want everyone else to be as miserable as you are." Her delusion was absolute. Even when presented with the exact wire transfers and the mechanical breakdown of the fraud, she actively chose to protect the son who had robbed her, rather than believe the daughter who had warned her. She preferred the comfortable lie of his success over the terrifying reality of his crime. "I will not let you ruin his life," Vivian continued, her voice cracking with raw, unhinged fury. "We do not need your money. We do not need your fake corporate advice. Trey will fix this glitch. He will hire the best lawyers in the city, and they will throw you in jail for what you are trying to do to him. You are a toxic, disgusting person, Nia. You are no daughter of mine. Do you hear me? You are dead to me." She screamed the final sentence with every ounce of hatred she possessed, attempting to inflict the ultimate emotional wound. She expected me to break down. She expected me to cry and beg for her forgiveness, retracting everything I had just said, just to stay in her good graces. But the little girl who desperately craved her mother's approval had died a long time ago. The woman standing in the penthouse felt absolutely nothing but a cold, profound sense of liberation. "Noted," I replied softly. I pressed the end call button, terminating the connection instantly. The violent screaming was abruptly cut off, replaced by the quiet hum of my air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city below. I stood completely still for a moment, processing the finality of the exchange. My mother had officially disowned me to protect the very man who was actively making her homeless. It was a spectacular display of misplaced loyalty. I felt a genuine smile spread across my face. The last remaining thread of guilt or familial obligation I might have harbored was entirely severed. They had chosen their side. Now they were going to face the absolute full force of the consequences. I did not hesitate. I walked briskly out of the kitchen and into my home office. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and woke up my dual monitors. I opened my encrypted email portal and drafted a new message to Marcus, my real estate attorney. I did not use any pleasantries. The instructions were purely tactical. "Marcus." I typed the keyboard, clacking sharply in the quiet room. "The grace period is officially over. The debtors have been informed of their severe delinquency, and they remain completely uncooperative and hostile. I am no longer willing to delay the legal proceedings. I want you to accelerate the eviction process immediately. Prepare the formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. Do not mail it. I want the final legal documents drawn up and ready for manual delivery. Let me know the exact moment the paperwork is finalized. I will be handling the service of process personally." I hit send. The email vanished into the server, initiating the final sequence of their destruction. The corporate machinery was now fully activated, and there was absolutely nothing Trey or his imaginary lawyers could do to stop it. I closed my laptop and looked out the window. My parents were frantically trying to piece together their shattered illusion, entirely unaware that the private investor they were so terrified of had just authorized their final eviction. They wanted to cast me out of the family. I was going to cast them out of their own home. Exactly 1 month after my mother screamed her final disownment through the phone, the sweltering heat of July settled heavily over Atlanta. Month 7 of the foreclosure timeline had officially arrived. By all rational financial metrics, my parents should have been frantically packing their belongings into cardboard boxes and securing a modest rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. They should have been consulting bankruptcy lawyers and preparing for the complete collapse of their lifestyle. Instead, they decided to throw a party. I knew about the event because my extended family treated social media like a live broadcasting network. I sat in the air-conditioned quiet of my penthouse office, watching the spectacle unfold through a series of public video updates posted by my younger cousins. The sheer level of financial delusion on display was absolutely staggering. Vivian and Desmond had transformed the sprawling backyard of the Cascade estate into a lavish summer gala. They had rented massive white canvas tents to block the brutal afternoon sun. They hired a premium catering service to circulate among the guests with silver trays of crab cakes, imported caviar, and crystal flutes of expensive champagne. A live jazz trio played softly on the flagstone patio, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to their impending doom. It was a desperate, mathematically impossible display of wealth designed specifically to combat the vicious neighborhood rumors. The bright yellow foreclosure notice that had been taped to their front door weeks earlier had not gone unnoticed by the affluent neighbors. Whispers had started circulating at the country club and local charity boards. To Vivian, the absolute worst fate imaginable was not homelessness or bankruptcy. It was public pity. She could not stomach the idea of her elite social circle looking down on her. So she likely drained whatever microscopic credit limits she had left on her platinum cards to buy premium seafood and pretend the sinking ship was actually a luxury cruise. The entire extended family was in attendance. Aunts, uncles, and cousins, who had always looked at my parents as the ultimate pinnacle of Black excellence, were lounging on the manicured lawn, completely oblivious to the radioactive financial crater beneath their feet. Harper was conspicuously absent, having clearly made good on her threat to flee to Buckhead the moment the bank accounts ran dry. But Trey was front and center, desperately trying to hold the crumbling facade together. I tapped the screen of my phone, unmuting a live video stream posted by my Aunt Beatrice. The camera panned across the crowd and settled perfectly on Trey. He was wearing a crisp white linen suit, looking every bit the successful venture capitalist he pretended to be. He walked to the center of the patio and tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute, demanding the attention of the garden party. The jazz trio immediately stopped playing, and the lively chatter of the extended family quieted down, turning their expectant eyes toward the golden child. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate with us today," Trey announced, his voice projecting confidently over the manicured lawn. "I know there have been some ridiculous rumors circulating recently, some malicious gossip about banking errors and clerical glitches regarding this beautiful historic estate. I want to put those rumors to rest right here and right now." I watched my father Desmond standing just behind Trey, nodding proudly, his chest puffed out in absolute defiance. My mother Vivian was standing next to him, smiling radiantly, completely insulated by the lie she had chosen to fiercely protect. "The traditional banking system is archaic and predatory." Trey continued, waving his hand dismissively to the crowd. "They tried to use a massive software glitch to aggressively intimidate my parents and repossess this property. But as you all know, I operate in the high-level private equity space. When my network heard about the bank's hostile tactics, they were absolutely appalled. So I made a few calls, and I am incredibly proud to announce that I have officially secured a private investor." The crowd murmured in impressed approval. Trey smiled broadly, soaking in their blind admiration, feeding off their gullibility to soothe his own massive insecurities. This investor represents a massive silent holding company, Trey lied effortlessly, spinning a web of corporate buzzwords. They reviewed my decentralized asset portfolio. They saw the immense value in our family legacy, and they stepped in to completely buy out the toxic bank debt. They have agreed to restructure the entire financial profile. We are not going anywhere. The house is completely secure and the legacy continues. The extended family erupted into enthusiastic applause. Aunt Beatrice cheered loudly into the camera lens. My father pulled Trey into a massive emotional hug, slapping him hard on the back. They were toasting to his brilliance. They were drinking expensive champagne and celebrating the complete fabrication of a rescue. They truly believed Trey had outsmarted the federal banking system and secured a billionaire angel investor to save them from ruin. I paused the video, locking my phone screen and plunging my office back into silence. The irony was so profound, it felt like a physical weight in the room. He was technically telling the absolute truth. A private investor operating through a silent holding company had indeed bought the debt. He just had absolutely no idea that the silent holding company was named Onyx Horizon Holdings, and the ruthless investor he was bragging about was the very sister he had mocked at Thanksgiving. I stood up from my desk and smoothed the lapels of my custom-tailored black power suit. Today was not a day for corporate gray or subtle neutral colors. Today was the day of the reckoning, and I dressed for a funeral. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase containing the fully executed 30-day notice to vacate the original forged power of attorney and the unredacted bank wire transfers. I walked out of my penthouse and took the private elevator down to the secure parking garage. A sleek, black chauffeured SUV was already waiting for me, idling quietly near the exit gates. I opened the heavy rear door and slid into the plush leather seat. Marcus, my cutthroat real estate attorney, was sitting across from me, reviewing a stack of thick manila folders. Next to him sat a broad-shouldered, off-duty county sheriff's deputy, who moonlit as a premium process server for the firm. The deputy was wearing his formal tactical uniform, complete with the heavy silver badge pinned to his chest and a utility belt wrapped around his waist. "Are the documents ready?" I asked, looking directly at Marcus. Marcus nodded, tapping the thick dossier resting on his lap. Fully executed, notarized, and legally binding, he confirmed, his tone purely professional. "They have zero legal recourse to halt the eviction. The property is yours." I looked out the tinted window of the SUV as the driver pulled out into the blinding Atlanta sunlight, merging onto the highway. "Take us to Cascade," I told the driver, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "It is time for them to meet the private investor." The heavy tires of the black chauffeured SUV crunched aggressively against the pristine gravel of the Cascade Estate driveway, the deep rumbling sound sharp and entirely out of place amidst the soft jazz and the delicate clinking of champagne flutes. The driver pulled the massive vehicle directly up to the towering wrought iron gates that opened to the sprawling backyard, throwing it into park with a heavy, definitive mechanical clunk. Through the dark-tinted windows of the cabin, I could see the sea of massive white canvas tents and the meticulously dressed extended family mingling on the manicured lawn. The enthusiastic applause for my brother's fabricated victory speech was just beginning to fade, replaced by the low, satisfied hum of impressed chatter. I took one final breath of the cool, conditioned air inside the vehicle, letting the absolute certainty of the moment wash over me. I pushed open the heavy rear door and stepped out into the suffocating July heat. Marcus stepped out from the opposite side of the vehicle, his expression an impenetrable mask of corporate lethality. He clutched the thick manila dossier tightly against his side, his posture rigid and entirely professional. The off-duty county sheriff's deputy exited the front passenger seat, his heavy tactical boots hitting the pavement with a loud thud. The brutal afternoon sun glinted sharply off his silver badge and the dark leather of his utility belt. He adjusted his uniform, a stark, undeniable symbol of absolute legal authority that instantly shattered the delicate illusion of a casual suburban garden party. We did not speak. We did not need to. We moved forward as a single, highly coordinated unit, a tactical strike force, entering a zone of absolute financial delusion. I led the way, my custom-tailored black power suit absorbing the fierce summer sun, providing a jarring visual contrast to the pastel linens and floral prints worn by the guests. My heels struck the flagstone path with the steady rhythmic cadence of a metronome counting down their final seconds of peace. As we rounded the corner of the historic Tudor mansion and stepped fully into the visual frame of the backyard, the atmosphere shifted with violent, terrifying speed. Aunt Beatrice, who had been holding her phone high in the air to record the opulent festivities, slowly lowered her arm, her mouth falling slightly open in pure shock. A younger cousin standing near the edge of the patio stopped mid-laugh, his eyes widening to the size of saucers, at the sudden jarring sight of the armed deputy marching across the lawn. The ripple of stunned silence spread across the backyard like a concussive shockwave. The live jazz trio immediately sensing the sudden drastic plunge in the crowd's energy, and spotting the law enforcement officer faltered on their instruments and then stopped playing entirely. The sudden absence of music left only the sharp echoing sound of my heels striking the stone patio. My parents were still standing near the center of the gathering, basking in the residual golden glow of Trey's fraudulent speech. My mother Vivian noticed the suffocating silence first. She turned gracefully, her radiant manufactured smile freezing instantly. The color rapidly drained from her face as she saw me approaching, flanked by a ruthless corporate attorney and a uniformed officer of the law. Desmond's chest, which had been puffed out with immense arrogant pride just seconds ago, visibly deflated. He took a stumbling half-step backward, staring at the deputy with wide, terrified eyes. Trey froze completely in his pristine white linen suit, the crystal champagne flute in his right hand, trembling so violently that the expensive golden liquid splashed over the rim, dripping down his knuckles and staining the flagstone beneath his feet. He knew immediately, with absolute gut-wrenching certainty, that his imaginary billionaire investor had not arrived to save him. Before I could reach the center of the patio, a figure abruptly stepped directly into my path, deliberately attempting to block my trajectory toward the main table. It was Harper. Apparently, the intoxicating allure of a fully catered garden party, the free champagne, and the desperate clawing need to maintain her elite country club aesthetic had temporarily overridden her previous dramatic decision to abandon her broke husband. She was wearing a massive, ridiculously oversized floppy sun hat and a flowing designer floral dress, glaring at me with the exact same toxic venom she had unleashed on Christmas Eve. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, stepping squarely onto the stone pathway directly in front of me, attempting to project a physical dominance she absolutely did not possess. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here," Harper hissed, her voice kept low but vibrating with pure, unadulterated malice. She leaned in closer, trying to intimidate me, her eyes darting nervously toward the deputy before locking back onto mine. "You do not belong in this family anymore. Your mother made that perfectly clear when she disowned you. We are celebrating Trey's massive financial victory today, and you are not going to ruin this beautiful party with your bitter, jealous energy. Turn around and take your little rent-a-cop back to whatever miserable apartment you crawled out of." I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace for even a fraction of a second. I did not offer her a sharp retort, a clever insult, or a defensive explanation. I did not even grant her the basic human dignity of eye contact. To me, she was entirely irrelevant, nothing more than a piece of cheap lawn furniture that had been carelessly left in the walkway. As I rapidly closed the physical distance between us, I simply kept moving forward with absolute unstoppable momentum. At the very last possible second, Harper, realizing with sudden panic that I was not going to stop and entirely unwilling to be physically bowled over onto the stone patio in front of the entire gaping extended family, flinched. She gasped and stepped sharply to the side. The wide brim of her absurd sun hat brushed against my shoulder as I walked right past her, leaving her stumbling slightly backward on her expensive wedges, completely ignored, entirely humiliated, and absolutely powerless to stop the incoming devastation. I marched directly to the large circular glass patio table situated in the dead center of the gathering, the exact spot where Trey had just delivered his triumphant, fraudulent speech. The crowd parted around me, stepping back quickly to give the armed deputy a wide, terrified berth. I stopped at the table, resting both of my hands flat on the warm glass, and looked directly into the panicked, bloodshot eyes of my older brother. Marcus stepped up to my right side, placing the heavy, ominous dossier firmly onto the center of the table with a loud smack. The deputy stood tall on my left, his hand resting casually near his radio, his stern gaze sweeping over the silent, paralyzed crowd. The charade was officially over. The heavy manila dossier rested squarely on the center of the glass patio table, looking like an explosive device ready to detonate. I did not rush. I took my time, reaching out with deliberate precision to flip open the thick cardboard cover. The loud snap of the metal binder rings echoing in the dead, silent backyard sounded like a gavel striking wood. I looked up, scanning the faces of the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had just been cheering for a phantom billionaire. The absolute quiet was so profound that the only sound left was the gentle rustling of the canvas tents in the warm summer breeze. Then I looked directly at my father Desmond, who was clutching his chest, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, and my mother Vivian, who was staring at the folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Marcus stood perfectly still beside me, his presence a silent reminder of the unbreakable legal reality, while the uniformed deputy rested his hand near his radio, ensuring nobody moved to interrupt the execution. Trey just gave a very moving speech. I began, my voice projecting clearly and effortlessly across the manicured lawn, carrying all the way to the back rows of the completely paralyzed guests. He told you about a ruthless banking system. He told you about a miraculous private investor swooping in to save the day. But Trey has always been an exceptional storyteller. I brought some reading material today because, unlike my brother, I prefer documented reality over creative fiction. I reached into the dossier and pulled out the first stack of papers. They were crisp legal copies of the original loan origination files, complete with the bank's watermarks. I slapped them down onto the glass right in front of Trey. 14 months ago, I announced making sure every single person in the extended family could hear every syllable. Trey presented my parents with a stack of paperwork. He claimed it was the final confirmation for paying off the mortgage on this historic estate. But tucked inside that massive stack was a general power of attorney. He had my parents sign away their legal financial rights without reading the fine print. He then took that notarized document, walked into a commercial bank, and leveraged their fully paid down home to extract a $450,000 home equity line of credit. He did not secure the family legacy. He actively stole it. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Aunt Beatrice dropped her phone onto the grass, the device tumbling silently onto the perfectly cut lawn. Desmond let out a choked, agonizing sound, gripping the edge of a nearby wrought iron chair for physical support as his knees visibly buckled. Trey opened his mouth to defend himself, but the absolute terror paralyzing his vocal cords rendered him completely mute. He just stood there, shaking his pristine white linen suit, suddenly looking incredibly cheap and ridiculous. I did not give them a single second to process the initial shock before I dropped the next piece of evidence. I pulled out the banking ledgers highlighted in bright, aggressive yellow marker to draw the eye directly to the outbound wire transfers. Now you might be wondering where nearly $500,000 went. I continued, picking up a specific wire transfer receipt and holding it up for the crowd to see clearly. It did not go into a high-yield trust or a massive venture capital fund. It went here. A direct wire transfer of $95,000 to a luxury automobile dealership in Buckhead. I turned my gaze slowly toward Harper, who was still standing near the edge of the patio, clutching her oversized sun hat. She froze, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror as she realized she was caught squarely in the blast radius. "That is exactly how Harper purchased her brand-new Tesla," I stated coldly, the words slicing through the thick, humid air. That vehicle was bought with the stolen equity of her in-laws' home, And right beneath that transaction is a $30,000 wire transfer to a premium concierge service. That is how Trey and Harper paid for their extravagant 2-week vacation in Dubai last winter. They have been parading around Atlanta, boasting about their massive self-made wealth, while literally spending the roof over my parents' heads. The aunts and uncles turned their collective gaze toward Harper. The admiration they had previously shown her instantly morphed into absolute disgust. The whispers began immediately sharp and unforgiving. Harper took a step back, shaking her head frantically, trying to formulate a denial, but the highlighted bank documents resting on the glass table were completely undeniable. She had built her entire influencer persona on stolen money, and her social execution was happening live in front of the exact people she desperately wanted to impress. But cars and luxury vacations only account for a fraction of the massive theft, I said, turning my attention back to the trembling golden child. The remaining $250,000 was wired directly to unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. Trey bought highly leveraged digital assets right before the entire market collapsed. His margin positions were liquidated. He gambled away the remaining balance and lost absolutely everything in less than 90 days. That is why he stopped paying the monthly interest on the loan. That is why the bank sent a foreclosure notice to the front door last month. He is not a venture capitalist. He is a broke, desperate fraud who destroyed his parents' financial security to fund his own delusions. Vivian let out a loud, piercing wail, covering her face with her trembling hands. The illusion she had fiercely protected, the lie she had disowned me to maintain, was violently ripped away in front of her entire country club social circle. There was no spinning this. There was no hiding it. The receipts were sitting right there in broad daylight. But Trey did tell you one true thing today, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal register, pulling the crowd back from the brink of chaos. I reached into the very back of the dossier and pulled out the final document. The paper was heavy and deeply embossed with the official county seal. I placed it gently on top of the pile, smoothing it out with my hand. He told you that a private investor operating through a silent holding company completely bought out the toxic bank debt. He told you that this entity is now in complete legal control of the property. That part is absolutely correct. The bank sold the debt to a firm called Onyx Horizon Holdings. I looked at my father, whose eyes were completely bloodshot, and then at my mother, who was weeping uncontrollably into her palms. Finally, I looked at Trey, who was staring at the embossed county seal as if he were staring at his own execution warrant. I am the sole managing member of Onyx Horizon Holdings. I announced, the words hanging heavy and absolute in the sweltering summer air. I bought the defaulted debt. I paid off the institutional lender in cash. I hold the deed of trust. The bank does not own this historic estate anymore. I do. The silence that followed was absolute. The extended family, the jazz musicians, the catering staff, everyone was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the twist. The despised black sheep, the daughter who had been mocked and banished, had returned not to seek forgiveness, but to claim the throne. I looked around the lavish setup, the white canvas tents, the silver trays of caviar, the crystal champagne flutes. I looked at the people who had called me a burden. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply stated the cold, undeniable legal reality. I did not come to a party, I announced, my voice echoing over the silent, stunned crowd. I came to inspect my property. The words hung in the air, heavy and immovable. For a fraction of a second, the backyard remained suspended in a breathless vacuum. Then the shockwave hit. It started as a low collective murmur among the aunts and uncles, rapidly escalating into a cacophony of gasps, angry whispers, and outright exclamations of horror. Uncle Marcus, who had always praised Trey's business acumen, shook his head in absolute disgust and turned his back on the table. Aunt Beatrice began rapidly texting on her phone, broadcasting the scandalous downfall of the golden child to the entire city before the caterers could even clear the caviar. Harper stood frozen on the stone pathway, her oversized sun hat suddenly looking like a clownish costume rather than a symbol of wealth. The mathematical reality of her situation crashed down upon her. She was not the wife of a wealthy venture capitalist. She was legally bound to a broke fraudster who had stolen from his own parents and lost it all. Her designer lifestyle, the Miami beach house, the endless bragging rights, everything vaporized in an instant. A jagged, ugly sob ripped from her throat. She dropped her crystal champagne flute onto the flagstone, letting it shatter into 100 pieces, and buried her face in her hands. She wept loudly, not out of sympathy for my parents, but out of pure selfish grief for her own obliterated social standing. Trey could not maintain the facade for another second. The crushing weight of the evidence combined with the public exposure in front of the very people he desperately needed to impress broke him completely. His legs gave out. The crisp white linen suit crumpled as he dropped heavily to his knees, right there on the warm patio stones. He looked up at me, his face streaked with sweat and tears, his arrogant smirk replaced by a mask of absolute terror. "Nia, please," Trey begged, his voice cracking, completely stripped of any dignity. "Please do not do this. You are my sister. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but you cannot take the house. I will figure out a way to pay you back. I will work multiple jobs. I will give you the Tesla. Just please do not ruin me in front of everyone." I stared down at him. The man who had mocked my career and told me to stop mooching off the family energy was now kneeling in the dirt pleading for his financial life. I felt absolutely no pity. "You ruined yourself, Trey," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "The Tesla is already being repossessed by the dealership because you stopped making the secondary insurance payments. And you cannot pay me back $450,000 by working minimum wage jobs. You are not a visionary, you are a thief." I shifted my gaze to my parents. Desmond and Vivian stood completely paralyzed, resembling two hollow statues placed carelessly in a beautiful garden. The entire foundation of their existence had just been violently ripped out from beneath them. Desmond's chest heaved as he struggled to process the total destruction of his legacy. He looked at the kneeling, weeping figure of his son, the boy he had held up as the ultimate standard of success, and saw nothing but a pathetic stranger. Vivian was trembling violently. Her perfect makeup was ruined by a silent, continuous stream of tears. She had spent my entire life comparing me to Trey, using him as a weapon to make me feel small, insignificant, and unworthy of her love. She had allowed him to siphon the equity out of her home while she criticized my tailored suits and my long hours at the office. She had chosen the comfortable, glittering lie over the cold, hard truth. And now the lie had completely collapsed, burying her in the rubble. I walked slowly around the glass patio table, closing the distance between myself and my mother. The crowd of relatives parted instantly, giving me a wide, respectful berth. I stopped just a few feet in front of Vivian. She could not bring herself to meet my eyes. She stared at the grass, completely broken by the public humiliation she had always feared more than death itself. "Look at me, Mom," I commanded. My tone was not angry. It was terrifyingly calm, carrying the absolute authority of the person who now owned the ground she was standing on. Vivian slowly raised her head. Her eyes were bloodshot, swimming with a mixture of profound regret and absolute terror. "7 months ago, we sat at a dining table inside that house," I said, gesturing toward the towering brick walls of the Tudor mansion. "I brought a dish that took me hours to make, trying to participate in a family tradition. And instead of thanking me, you looked me dead in the eyes and told me I was a disappointment. You told me my career meant nothing because I did not have a husband to validate my existence. You praised Trey for his fake crypto wealth, and you told me I was nothing but a burden. You said I had always been a burden." Vivian let out a small, agonizing whimper, covering her mouth with her trembling hand, as the memory of her own cruel words echoed back to haunt her. I did not cry. I continued, my voice carrying clearly over the silent backyard. I did not scream. I just went back to my corporate job. I crunched the numbers you despise so much. I closed the deals. I earned the capital. And when I saw your defaulted mortgage sliding across my desk, headed for a public auction that would have left you entirely homeless and destitute, I made a business decision. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so the absolute weight of my words would strike her with maximum impact. You called me a burden at Thanksgiving, I said, locking my eyes onto hers, ensuring she felt every single ounce of the reality shift. So I bought your biggest burden. I bought the debt Trey saddled you with. I bought the house you used to make me feel small. I bought the very legacy you told me I would never be a part of. And I did it all without a husband, without a co-signer, and without a single dollar of your money. Desmond buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, wretched sob. The extended family watched in absolute mesmerized silence as the true hierarchy of the family was permanently cemented. The golden child was weeping on his knees. The matriarch and patriarch were broken and defenseless. And the black sheep stood victorious, holding the deed to their entire world. I turned away from my mother, leaving her completely speechless, and walked back to the glass patio table. Marcus was already holding the final document. It was a single sheet of stark white paper, completely devoid of the complex banking jargon that filled the rest of the dossier. I took the paper from his hand and dropped it directly onto the glass right next to the highlighted wire transfers. This is a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute finality. You have exactly 1 month to pack up your antique furniture, your expensive china, and whatever dignity you have left, and clear out of my house. If there is a single piece of property left on this estate on day 31, the county sheriff standing right beside me will forcefully remove you, and your belongings will be dragged to the curb. There will be no extensions. There will be no negotiations. Desmond let out a ragged, desperate gasp, taking a step forward with his hands raised in a pleading gesture. "Nia, you cannot do this," he cried, tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. "Where are we supposed to go? We do not have any liquid savings left. We have no credit. You are evicting your own parents into the street." "You are evicting yourselves," I replied coldly. "You chose to blindly trust a man who used your home as a personal piggy bank. You chose to ignore the warning signs, and you chose to disown the only person who actually had the power to save you. My charity officially ran out the moment you told me I was dead to you on the phone. You can ask Trey to let you crash on the floor of his luxury apartment if he still has the keys." I shifted my gaze down to Trey, who was still kneeling on the flagstone patio, shaking uncontrollably. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and vacant, completely shattered by the reality of his impending homelessness. But I was not finished with him. The eviction was merely the financial consequence. The legal consequence was going to be much more severe. "And Trey," I added, my tone dropping to a sharp, lethal whisper that forced the entire crowd to lean in. "I did not just buy the debt. I bought the entire loan origination file. That includes the heavily documented, heavily time-stamped forged power of attorney you submitted to the institutional lender. Marcus and my legal team have already forwarded the unredacted file to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You committed felony wire fraud across state lines to fund your crypto gambling. The federal agents are not going to send a process server with a yellow piece of paper. They are going to send a tactical team with a federal warrant." Trey let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying animal. He collapsed entirely, falling forward onto his hands and pressing his forehead against the warm patio stones, weeping with loud, ugly, heaving sobs. He was not just losing his fake wealth, he was going to federal prison. Harper, who had been standing frozen nearby, finally snapped. She let out a piercing scream directed entirely at her husband, cursing him, calling him a worthless liar, and throwing her ruined designer hat at his kneeling form. She spun around on her expensive wedges and sprinted blindly across the lawn, pushing past my stunned aunts and uncles, desperately trying to flee the toxic crater of her own making. I did not stay to watch the rest of the implosion. I had delivered the message. I had reclaimed my power. I turned my back on the screaming, crying ruins of my former family. I began the walk back down the flagstone path toward the front gates. Marcus and the armed deputy fell into step flawlessly behind me. The crowd of extended family members parted like the Red Sea. Nobody reached out to touch me. Nobody dared to utter a single word of reprimand or defense for my parents. They simply stared in absolute terrified awe as the woman they had spent decades dismissing walked right through them, owning every single inch of the ground beneath their feet. I did not look back. Not when Vivian began wailing my name, begging me to come back and talk to her. Not when Desmond shouted that he was sorry. Their apologies were entirely worthless, purchased only by the terrifying reality of their immediate destruction. The heavy wrought iron gates loomed ahead, framing the black chauffeured SUV waiting patiently on the gravel driveway. The driver quickly stepped out and pulled the heavy rear door open for me. I slid into the cool leather interior, sinking into the plush seat. Marcus and the deputy got in, closing the doors with a series of heavy, solid thuds that instantly muted the chaotic screaming from the backyard. The silence inside the cabin was immediate and profoundly beautiful. "Take me home," I told the driver. The SUV slowly pulled out of the Cascade estate, merging onto the quiet, tree-lined suburban streets. I watched the sprawling historic mansions roll past the tinted windows. For 32 years, that neighborhood had been a fortress of anxiety and impossible expectations. It had been a place where I was constantly measured against an imaginary standard and relentlessly found wanting. But as the vehicle accelerated toward the highway, leaving the affluent suburbs entirely behind, I felt a massive physical weight lift from my chest. By the time I arrived back at my sleek glass tower in Midtown, the sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden glow over the Atlanta skyline. I took the private elevator up to my penthouse and walked through the front doors. The apartment was perfectly quiet, perfectly clean, and entirely mine. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the sprawling city below. I had entered the holiday season as a discarded burden, a woman desperately trying to prove her worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of seeing it. I emerged 7 months later as a multimillionaire who had surgically dismantled her abusers and legally acquired their entire kingdom. The toxic cycle was permanently broken. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret. I felt absolute total freedom. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you made it this far, drop a crown emoji in the comments below to let me know you are part of the squad that never backs down from toxic family members. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about reclaiming your power. Remember, family is supposed to be your safe haven, but if they choose to treat you like a burden, do not be afraid to buy the whole building and hand them the eviction notice. Stay strong, stay focused, and I will see you in the next video.